There is a paradox at the heart of mastery that very few people understand. The samurai spent their entire lives learning to do less. They feared idleness, yes, but not for the reason you think. They did not fear it because they were lazy or undisciplined. They feared it because they understood something that modern people have completely forgotten, that doing nothing and doing everything are not opposites. They are the same thing seen from different angles. This is the principle that separated the greatest warriors from the merely skilled, and it is a principle that will reshape how you approach your own life if you have the patience to understand it. Chapter 1. The Contradiction. Takeshi Yamamoto was a man who had optimized his entire existence. He woke at 5 in the morning, he ran 5 kilometers, he checked his emails before breakfast, he attended meetings, he managed projects, he returned calls, he answered messages, he worked through lunch, he stayed at the office until 7 in the evening. And when he came home, he did not rest. He read business books, he listened to podcasts about productivity, he took online courses about leadership. He told himself that he was building something great. He told himself that this discipline would lead to mastery. But something was missing. His hands were always moving, always reaching, always grasping for the next thing. And yet, his life felt increasingly empty.
One evening, while scrolling through his phone, Takeshi came across a passage from Miyamoto Musashi, the legendary sword master. It read, "The greatest technique is no technique. The most perfect action is the action that appears effortless because it flows from a mind that has already decided." Takeshi read it 3 times. He did not understand it. How could no technique be the greatest technique? How could a mind that had decided still move without effort? He saved the quote and moved on with his evening, but something in those words had lodged itself in his consciousness like a splinter.
Chapter 2. The Principle of Ma. In Japanese aesthetics, there is a concept called Ma. It is not a word that translates easily into English. It is the space between things. It is the silence between notes in music. It is the empty space in a painting. It is the pause between breaths. The samurai understood that Ma was not empty. It was full. It was pregnant with potential. It was the space in which everything meaningful happened. A sword master did not defeat his opponent through constant motion. He defeated him through the strategic placement of stillness. He moved only when movement was necessary. He remained silent only when silence had more power than words. He did this not because he was lazy or afraid to act. He did this because he had trained himself to see the difference between motion and action.
Motion is what happens when a person is restless. Action is what happens when a person is clear. Motion is the thrashing of a drowning man. Action is the precise strike of a master. The samurai understood this distinction so deeply that they built their entire system of training around it. They would spend hours in meditation, not to escape the world, but to sharpen their ability to perceive the exact moment when action became necessary. They would spend days in silence, not to avoid communication, but to ensure that when they spoke, every word carried the weight of truth. This was not idleness. This was the highest form of discipline. Chapter 3. The Fear. But the samurai also feared something. They feared idle hands. Not the hands that were still. They feared the hands that moved without purpose. They feared the mind that was busy without being focused. They feared the life that was full of motion but empty of meaning. This is what they meant by idle hands. They did not mean hands that rested. They meant hands that moved out of habit, out of anxiety, out of the desperate need to appear productive. A samurai would rather sit in perfect stillness for a full day than move aimlessly for a single hour, because movement without intention is not discipline, it is dysfunction.
It is a man running in place, convinced that he is moving forward. Takeshi began to see this distinction in his own life. His 5-kilometer run in the morning was genuine discipline. It was a non-negotiable action that strengthened his body and cleared his mind. But his checking of emails before breakfast was not discipline. It was anxiety disguised as productivity. His reading of business books while lying in bed was not education. It was the avoidance of rest. His constant answering of messages and calls was not responsiveness. It was the refusal to be alone with his own thoughts. He had filled his life with motion, believing that motion was the same thing as progress, and in doing so, he had eliminated the very space in which genuine growth could occur. Chapter 4. The Discipline of Elimination. One morning, Takeshi made a decision. He would stop doing things. Not all things, but most things. He would identify the actions that were truly essential and eliminate everything else. This was not laziness. This was the samurai principle of shibui, the art of elegant simplicity. He canceled his business book subscriptions. He stopped listening to productivity podcasts. He stopped checking his emails before breakfast. He stopped staying at the office past 6 in the evening. He stopped answering every call and message immediately. Instead, he created what he called response time. He would check his messages twice a day, not because he was inefficient, but because efficiency had become a trap. The constant availability of response had convinced him that he was indispensable, but the truth was simpler. He was just anxious.
The first week was difficult. His mind screamed at him. It told him he was falling behind. It told him that other people were working harder. It told him that his career would suffer. It told him that he was lazy and undisciplined. But Takeshi sat with these thoughts. He did not resist them. He did not try to replace them with positive affirmations. He simply observed them, the way a samurai would observe an opponent's movements before striking. And gradually, something shifted. The anxiety began to quiet. His mind, no longer scattered across 100 different tasks, began to focus. He found himself thinking more deeply about his actual work. He found himself making better decisions. His productivity, measured not in hours worked but in meaningful output, increased dramatically.
Chapter 5. The Deeper Understanding. But something else happened too, something that Takeshi had not anticipated. As he eliminated the motion from his life, he began to perceive ma everywhere. He noticed the silence in conversations. He noticed the spaces between his thoughts. He noticed the moments when he was truly present and the moments when he was lost in distraction. The samurai called this heightened perception zanshin, the spirit that remains. It was the ability to be aware of what was happening in the moment and what was about to happen next. It was not anxiety about the future. It was clarity about the present. And this clarity could only emerge in the absence of constant noise.
Musashi wrote in his Book of 5 Rings that a master swordsman could defeat 10 opponents not because he moved faster or struck harder, but because he wasted no motion. Every movement was necessary. Every pause was intentional. And this is what separated the master from the amateur in any field. The amateur believes that more is always better. The master knows that less, when chosen correctly, is everything. This is why the samurai feared idle hands, not because they were lazy, but because they understood that a life of constant, meaningless motion was a kind of death. It was a slow erasure of self. A man who cannot stop moving cannot know who he really is. A man who cannot be still cannot hear the voice of his own wisdom. Chapter 6. The Transformation. 6 months later, Takeshi's life had changed in ways that were both subtle and profound. His career had not suffered. If anything, it had improved. He had been promoted. He had taken on fewer projects but completed them with greater excellence.
His relationships had deepened because he was actually present when he was with people, instead of half listening while checking his phone. He slept better, he felt calmer, and most importantly, he had begun to understand himself. In the space that he had created through elimination, he had discovered who he actually was beneath all the doing. This is the teaching of Mu. This is the wisdom that the samurai protected with their lives. The greatest strength is not found in constant action. It is found in the ability to distinguish between action and motion, between presence and busyness, between a life that is full and a life that is merely crowded. The samurai knew that true discipline was not the ability to do more. It was the ability to do less and to do it with absolute precision. They knew that the road to mastery was not paved with endless effort. It was paved with the elimination of everything unnecessary. And they feared idle hands not because they were enemies of rest, but because they understood that a hand that moves without purpose is a hand that has surrendered its power. Chapter 7. The Awakening. The question is not whether you should do more or do less. The question is whether what you are doing matters. The samurai spent their entire lives learning to answer this question with complete clarity. They meditated not to escape their responsibilities. They meditated so that every action they took would flow from a mind that had already decided. They practiced their art not to accumulate techniques, but to strip away everything except what was essential. And in doing so, they discovered something that changed everything. They discovered that when you eliminate the unnecessary, the necessary becomes luminous. It becomes obvious. It becomes unavoidable.
Look at your own life. Look at the hours you spend each day. How much of it is truly necessary? How much of it is motion disguised as action? How much of it is the desperate attempt to convince yourself and others that you are productive, important, valuable? This is the question that Takeshi asked himself, and this is the question that the samurai asked themselves every single day. The answer is not always comfortable, but it is always liberating. Because once you understand the difference between doing and undoing, between building and cluttering, between presence and distraction, you have begun the journey toward mastery. You have begun to understand the art of doing nothing, and you have begun to fear idle hands, not as a threat, but as a teacher.